Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 145 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This week, we are trying something new, and why not, right? Life is all about experiencing new things, is it not? So today we are bringing you an interview in which I, your host, appear on another podcast to be interviewed all about the topic of desistance from crime. Specifically, I am going to be sharing with you all the interview that Dr. Craig Waleed conducted with me for his podcast, which is entitled Prison to Promise. Now, loyal listeners may recognize that name. Craig Waleed was a guest of the Criminologist podcast way back on episode 71. Craig recently reached out to me to gauge my interest in coming on his program to chat all about desistance. And since that topic is near and dear to my heart, I, of course, agreed. A little bit about Craig Waleed before I share our conversation, though. Dr. Craig Waleed is an experienced educator and counselor and author who is passionate about disrupting the community to prison pipeline and reducing post-incarceration recidivism. Dr. Waleed believes that the combination of academic training and preparation, along with proper education, can help lead to true liberation, as he puts it. Dr. Waleed is a motivational speaker and certified restorative practices group facilitator and has been involved in various projects focusing on helping formerly incarcerated people. These include his aforementioned podcast, panel discussions, workshops, mentoring, and coaching, and a recently published autobiography. Again, his podcast is entitled Prison, a podcast which explores the strategies formerly incarcerated people use to avoid returning to prison and talk about the things they are doing today to create, as Dr. Waleed refers to it, purpose-driven lives. Please enjoy Dr. Craig Waleed interviewing me as to the topic of desistance from crime, and I will see you all on the other side. Do this. Let's talk some desistance.
All right. Right on. And that's great. So thanks, Joe. Thanks so much. Today is just a little different here on the Prison to Promise podcast because I have Joe here who is a podcaster. And the thing that really made me want to get Joe on here is to talk about recidivism. And because Joe, if I'm not mistaken, that's one of your areas of expertise, recidivism and desistance. Yeah, I don't know why I was having just such a brain freeze in that moment.
No worries, Craig. Yeah, it's a newer term. So in that respect, it's sort of symbolic that, yeah, and it's not just you, it's a lot of policymakers and practitioners who should really know about, as you just alluded to, this concept of what we refer to as desistance from crime, or essentially that process of exiting a life of crime.
I'm really curious to know what made you want to, or how did you come to become a specialist in recidivism and desistance and reduction of crime versus, say, a crime fighter or something like that?
Great question, Dr. Waleed. Great question. So my background is in probation and parole, community corrections. I have been in a probation and parole capacity for about 34 years. Started my career down in the Florida Department of Corrections way back in 1988 as like I said, a probation officer. I eventually got more interested in the training side of things, and I was looking to shake up my career. So I went down that rabbit hole and learned everything I could about the principles of risk, need, and responsivity, which if your listeners are in a corrections field, they should know about R&R, as we call it, the risk, need, responsivity framework, which is really the standard operating procedure for correctional agencies, Craig, really all over the world. I've trained alongside and trained folks on multiple continents. And so it is the common denominator, if you will. But to answer your question, I am always looking for process improvement. And I realize that as much efficacy as there is to that approach of risk, need, responsivity, we're still not getting great results or great effect sizes. I mean, it's the most impactful model that we can have, but I just felt we owe this so much more to our stakeholders, whether those are the clients or the community victims, even practitioners who are putting their blood, sweat, and tears into this. So we'll talk more about this, of course, Craig, but the short version is we were focusing as a vocation so much on those reasons why individuals such as yourself, for example, who I know you have lived experiences. Absolutely. We focused so much on why individuals enter into a life of crime with the assumption that, okay, if we address those variables that tell us why folks entered into a life of crime, we will see reductions in recidivism, which we will. But when the Desistance researchers started publishing their work, it was discovered, we talked to people like Craig Waleed, who have been crime-free now for many, many years. And we discovered that those factors as to why individuals exit a life of crime are not necessarily the same as to why people exit a life of crime. So we really do need to take a full court press, if you will, and examine both of those things to attain a much more holistic approach at harm reduction and helping the clients we serve.
Yeah. So let's dive into that then, in an abbreviated version, if we could, but, what are the reasons that people exit crime? Let's start there because that's our focus, desistance, recidivism reduction, I guess, for that matter. But why do people exit crime?
Yeah. And I'll try to distill this down for your listeners, Craig. People who know me know I can get real nerdy and wonky, and I don't want to turn people off by doing that. So I'm going to talk about this in general themes. And there's currently, and I need to give credit where credit is due. This comes from a lot of the work of Dr. Fergus McNeil, who's over in Scotland, who is really a game changer when it comes to desistance research. And there's currently about 4 different theories to answer your question as to why people exit crime. The first theory is simply that of what they call maturation, or I'm sure you've heard of this notion of aging out.
Yeah.
Eventually everybody, even the high risk clienteles with a few notable exceptions, but most individuals will eventually age out of crime. If we do nothing as professionals, most justice involved individuals will desist. And when I get pushback on this from practitioners, Craig, particularly those who work in a custodial setting, I'll challenge them and I'll say, well, guys, if you don't believe me, because not surprisingly, we tend to get a little cynical in corrections. Go look at the pods you work in. Go look at the wings. How many 50 and 60-year-old inmates are you housing right now? Or if you're in a community setting, how many 50 and 60-year-olds are you supervising? I mean, it's anecdotal, but it's true. People will eventually age out of crime if we do nothing. Yeah. Now, the trick with desistance theory is, okay, what can we do as professionals to accelerate that finish line, if you will?
And if you would, real quick, for our listeners, define what desistance is, because though you and I know, maybe some folks listening don't know.
Yeah, thank you. I got a little ahead of my skis there. Again, when we talk about desistance, it's really desisting from crime, but that actually opens up a lot of other questions as to how we're really defining that. So let me take these two concepts and I'll circle back to where I was going with maturation theory and just give some broad definitions. When we talk about primary desistance, that is defined as behavior. So recidivism, basically, which has been the traditional metric that we use in corrections and criminal justice. Are people reoffending? Are they reoffending within a year or within other time frame? And most folks, I think, are familiar with that term, recidivism rates or reoffending rates. So the first definition, Craig, of recidivism is simply behavioral. Are they still recidivating? But what I like about desistance rather is it goes deeper than that. Mm-hmm. When we talk about secondary desistance, we're talking about identity. You could have somebody not committing crimes anymore because they might just be too old or incapacitated or for some other reasons are unable to commit crimes, but they still root for the bad guy in the theater. They still have negative thoughts towards the system and towards law enforcement and the courts. They're still that blankety blank, if you know what I'm saying. Yeah. So they still have that identity. So when we talk about people who have attained secondary desistance, their identity has shifted from one of shot caller, hustler, pimp, gangster to one of father, husband, valued employee, citizen, community member. And you can see the subtle difference there between, well, Craig's not offending. Craig hasn't been arrested in a year versus Craig sees someone totally different now when he looks in the mirror than he did at the peak of his offending. That's what we mean by secondary desistance. You've actually changed your identity. And when I train or teach on this, Craig, to get this point across to the audience about identity transformation, I'll challenge them and say, what was your identity, for example, your senior year in high school or your freshman year in college? Or juxtapose your identity when you were single versus when you became a parent. And when people see themselves as a parent, then it's easy to see, well, this kind of relates to behavior too. So if you really want to get at more primary desistance, work on that identity. And then the third level of how we define desistance, tertiary desistance, is really all about relationships. And essentially, have you been accepted back into the community? So again, if we want to recap, we can have primary desistance. Someone's not committing crimes.
Right.
Then we can have secondary desistance where not only are they not behaving criminally, but they identify differently. They see themselves as a different individual. But when we attain tertiary desistance, it's you're now welcome back into society as a pro-social member of society. We're not going to shun you via housing restrictions or employment restrictions or, even view you as an other, if we will. You've been accepted back into the fold, and that's tertiary desistance. So to answer your question, that's what drew me to it was our current operating system, at least here in the United States, is at best, we're going for that first level. We're going for behavioral. Can we just get Craig or whomever not to reoffend? But desistance is more than just not reoffending. It is really that true reintegration.
Yeah. And, just hearing you say that makes me think about some approaches to medicine, which is sometimes it's just superficial. They don't want to root out the cause, so for whatever reason, they'll just, give you medication, but never fix the issue. But here we're talking about going to the root of the person, not just their behavior, but who they think they are, who they want to be, who they are becoming, and then all of those supports that they have to help shore them up, so to speak.
Yeah, it's really appealing to me for all the reasons that you just articulated, Craig. And I think for the practitioner, it's more rewarding as well, because you're seeing much more of that transformation, if you will, beyond somebody just not showing up Monday morning on the arrest log from the weekend or whatever. You're literally assisting and changing that who that person is at their core.
And so when we think about people changing, do you think people are having a greater frequency of change later in life or across the spectrum of ages?
Boy, that's a great question. I do know, and we were talking about this earlier when I was talking about one theory of desistance simply says, again, maturation, or that they'll age out. And a lot of that does look at brain development. I think what you're getting at is, where they're at in the change process. Most individuals, I mean, not everybody, but a lot of folks, for example, do dabble in delinquency. It's what they refer to as this sort of age limited trajectory of crime, commonly known as juvenile delinquency. We see that spike at 15, 16 of delinquent behavior. And then most folks, because they have things in place that justice involved individuals don't have in place, a good support system, for example, things of that nature. Then they sort of peak out at 15, 16 real quick with this delinquency. But then you get the more life course persistent folks who get into more serious criminal trajectories. But as I was saying, Craig, even those peak out in the late 20s, which I don't think we do a good enough job in corrections of public relations. I don't even think most practitioners know that, much less members of the community, how stark that drop off is. We used to joke around that a crime fighter's best friend was a 30th birthday party, because most people will age out of crime at the age of 30.
Yeah.
Now that's tied to a lot of other things. And if we get to these other models of desistance, that aging is tied to a lot of other things, such as social bonds and rewarding employment and that kind of thing. But it all needs to be considered. Yeah.
Yeah. But so just based on what we're talking about thus far, it makes me think crime is a young person's game.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
Most definitely. And another issue we have too, and I sort of alluded to this before when I said most folks age out, we tend to, maybe it's just human nature, but we tend to look at the outliers and then sadly form opinions based on that, or even policy based on that. The older offender who, again, just draws the attention. But again, that's not the norm. That's really not the norm.
I think that's just in general. You see older people, older animals, we all just kind of slow down. We're not making those rash decisions anymore.
Right. But then you get I don't know if you remember who Whitey Bulger is. Yeah. He was the FBI's most wanted, and he was picked up after how many years on the run was it, Craig, in San Diego?
Quite a long time, though.
But I tell folks, Whitey Bulger is the exception to the rule. Most people aren't, either offending or on the run or still having that criminal identity into their 70s and 80s.
Right.
But we get these high profile cases that people think that's the norm. And I'm here to tell you it's not.
Right. I think people who've been incarcerated or who are currently incarcerated are hyper villainized, where most of the folks are not these super villains, these super criminals. Yeah. But what are some of the other models? I don't know if we'll have time to really dig into all of them, but what are some of those other models that you talked about?
So again, when I talked about those various theories of desistance, one was just let folks age, leave them alone and they'll age out. The other one really looks at social bonds. Now, there's a lot of connections with this to the aforementioned risk need responsivity model, which does put a lot of weight on one's companions, because it gets into, or relies rather, on a lot of social learning theory and model behavior. But as far as the desistance folks go, they realize that it's not just having people in your life who are going to model pro-social behavior, but it's about the ties you have to those people. And it's really about surrounding yourself with people that will provide what we call social capital, or giving you opportunities and to exit a life of crime. So again, in the old, or I shouldn't say the old, but in the risk need responsivity model, when we might do an assessment and say, well, you've been assessed as having a lot of negative peers and we need to address that. Well, a lot of folks might just sort of play whack-a-mole and say, these are the your gangster friends you can't hang out with anymore, but they don't replace it with anything.
Right.
Or if they do replace it with somebody, let's say we do another risk assessment within a year and we say, oh, you're scoring much better now in the area of companions because you've surrounded yourself with people who might not have criminal records, might not be involved in the criminal justice system. So technically they would be assessed or scored as positive. But what social capital is about is, again, surrounding that individual with folks who are going to afford them off ramps out of criminality, whether that's in employment or if they're struggling with substance abuse. And you could, each of us, all of us, your listeners, could look at our own social capital and say, are these folks helping me get closer to my hopes and dreams, or are they reflective of barriers to those hopes and dreams? Mm-hmm. So people with rich social capital find themselves desisting from crime. Mm. Whereas if you think of somebody who is in the language we use, at least a high risk client, mm-hmm. and their social capital, they don't have anybody who, again, could give them those assets to steer themselves out of a life of criminality. So that's a big one. Yeah. Social capital, social bonds, mm-hmm. surrounding yourself with social people. Almost think, I know you and I, Craig, are big on LinkedIn, but if you think of people who have vast amounts of LinkedIn connections, they have a lot of social capital. Yeah. Doesn't mean they have a lot of friends or a lot of people who haven't been locked up. It's like, no, you have a lot of people that can afford you opportunities for growth. Mm-hmm. And that's another theory of desistance is you need to surround yourselves with those types of people. Yeah. People that can help you blossom or lead you into those opportunities for growth. Yeah. I remember when I got out of prison, a friend of mine says to me, you have to learn how to borrow other people's integrity. And in a sense, that was, building social capital. Mm-hmm. And so, that's very important. We could do this, Craig. Look at your own social capital and you could juxtapose what it was like when you were either offending or when you were just released mm-hmm. versus what it is now. Yeah. Yeah. And how much of that success, of your success, or even, of your change process, could you attribute to what we are now defining as your social capital, your relationships with people like me, people on LinkedIn who have opened up other training, consulting opportunities for you. That was all the result of you augmenting your social capital. Yeah. Yeah. And I think for people who are listening, people who might be trying to transition from offending to living a straight-laced life, I think a big piece is also being unafraid to allow yourself to be vulnerable. I think that's important. That's not probably one of these criminogenic factors, but I think it's something that people need to be willing to do. Oh, 100%. Yeah. Change, any type of change is difficult. Yeah. Like people, can see their doctor and the doctor might say, if you don't quit smoking, you'll die of cancer. Or if you don't lose weight, you're going to lose a limb due to obesity. And why wouldn't those people do that? Or if you don't stop drinking, you're going to have destroyed relationships and job loss, but they keep drinking. Yeah. It's because change is hard. It's as simple as that. We're creatures of habit. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so there's these neural pathways that get burned into our cognitive space, into our brain, and it's hard to undo them. So hard. Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the neural pathways. I've been dabbling a little bit in neurocriminology and learning about the brain science, if you will. But those pathways, you're right. The more I just like to use analogies, and I think of, a field, a shortcut with a pathway, and that pathway might have been to addiction or criminality, or it might have been to making your bed every morning. But those familiar pathways are the ones that we're more comfortable with, and it's hard to plow those new pathways, which in this sense, we're talking about, again, different cognitions. But change is hard. Mm-hmm. It makes me think about even more literal when we think about shortcuts. I remember as a kid, there being shortcuts through someone's backyard or whatever, and then they put up a fence, and then so people try to jump the fence or tear the fence down because they don't want to change, but eventually once the barrier stands, the pathway grows, and then, you forget that pathway was ever there, sort of like our neural pathways. Yeah.
through, I think, intentionality, we can build new and different neural pathways and create roadblocks so that we can find our way. But it takes a lot of work.
Yeah. And I would contend as a lot of it, like we've been talking about, comes with age. It comes with who you surround yourself with. And it comes with, and this is the third theory of desistance, if you don't mind. It's what is referred to as one's narrative identity, or that identity transformation. And I alluded to this before, but you could use yourself, Craig, or I could use myself in any situation. Identity is, and this is what I like about these theories, is they're all kind of linked. Identity is linked to social capital, who you associate with, really informs your identity, rather.
Absolutely.
And even your maturity, involves your identity. I've got another connection. He's been on my show a few times, Ed Flanagan over in England. And one of his expressions, having spent about 50, I think, of his 65 years on earth, he's had about a 50-year criminal career before he finally desisted and got sober. But his expression that I love to share is, you show me your friends, I'll show you your future.
Absolutely. The old timer's been saying that a long time.
Yeah. And again, it ties to this identity.
Yeah.
It's, if you want someone to desist, this other theory says, is work on that identity.
Yeah.
Because identity drives behavior. And there's a gentleman by the name of Shad Maruna, who's actually an American, but he's teaching over in Northern Ireland now. He really leans into this notion of identity transformation and how identity is linked to behaviors. And he does a great job of looking at, hey, it's not just us in desistance theory that think this. He points out a lot of other entities tap into this notion of, if we can just alter someone's identity, we can get them to behave in a certain way, whether it's fraternities, who say, you've got to have a fraternity name, and you've got to pledge, and you've got to do all this. And then that's why we get you to do all these silly things to fraternity that most people would say, why would you do that? Or it's entities like,
I'm also thinking about advertisement, if that doesn't tap into people's identity, when you get this product, or if you purchase this product, you're being smart, you're being attractive, you're being, whatever.
Right. That the brand you wear, the label you wear, whatever, right? Then you're one of the pretty people or whatever. Yeah.
And so this speaks, I'm not sure where you're going, but what I'm thinking about is just how this really speaks to the seat of all success that people can find. And that is seated within one's thinking, one's perception of themselves and how they show up in the world.
Yeah. And that's what I love about this topic, Craig, is, yes, we're talking about it within a criminal justice, criminology setting. But to your point, these are commonly held, beliefs. A lot of this you see in other things, whether it's, as you're referring to, sort of this idea of self-actualization, believe in your dreams. It's all true. We just have never really applied it to reintegration before.
Yeah. And, and I think in part, maybe we haven't applied this to reintegration because of all of the other barriers that a large percentage of people returning to the community are facing, that all of the energy or effort has been in trying to remove or reduce the barriers.
Yeah. And that's a big part of it too. And there are so many other sort of systemic barriers, as you said, that make this work difficult for those trying to do it, whether they're statutory, legislative, or even, anchored in bias and discrimination.
Yeah. And we know that that's all there.
Yeah.
All of that.
Yeah.
Legislation, policy, bias and discrimination.
Even within the criminal justice system. I mean, sadly, I could train up and we could get a really good cadre of probation and parole officers. But if we're not on the same page as judges, prosecutors, police officers, we're sort of the lone voice in the wilderness. Yeah. Yeah.
And they're all separate entities, in a sense, all separate entities serving the one king, so to speak,
Yeah. Yeah.
But they're all on different pages. Yeah.
Yeah. So makes it challenging. Yeah.
Yeah. So couple other questions. And one is, how can someone increase or help someone increase their likelihood to desist criminal behavior?
Boy, what a great question. I like to keep things basic, and I think sometimes we talk so much in wonky and abstract terms, but you're right. Just like anyone who's maybe not even a player in the system, for example, one of the things, and I know you've been on my podcast, Craig, but one of my missions in life is to really try to tear down the bias and the misconception that we have about justice involved individuals and reintegration. So to answer your question, I think it just starts with just viewing someone for not something they did on the worst day of their life, but looking at them for who they can become. So to answer your question, stop looking in the rearview mirror.
Yeah.
And start looking for the potential and good in people rather than just looking in the rearview mirror and waiting for them to repeat that bad behavior, and stop labeling and looking at them through that lens.
Yeah. And, I think I think that's all so great. And one of the things I'm also thinking about is how challenging it is to perceive or misperceive people through these lenses that don't shine favorable light on people. Some of the terms we use, especially when we talk about incarcerated people, is the inmate, the prisoner, the convict, and we're just so used to doing it. We remove the person-centered language,
Yeah. I could do an entire podcast just on the labeling theory, but you're right. It is alive and well, in corrections, even in official speak. We still throw out terms, like you said, of offender, inmate, prisoner, without realizing the damning effects that has on somebody. I've stolen this from other trainers in Desistance, but only in corrections do we take, like I said, something that snapshot of what someone did on the worst day of their life and turn that into an adverb, and then just throw that adverb around for the next 5 years of supervision or the next 10 years of a sentence. I mean, if I got up out of this chair in the middle of this interview and I tripped getting out of this chair, in the moment, you could label me as a tripper, one who trips, but you wouldn't call me that for the next 5 years.
Right. Because when we do this incident in a moment in time.
And when we do this on a professional level, again, I don't really think we understand the magnitude of what that does in the person who we're trying to instill a change in. I tell a story sometimes when I train about, imagine if you go to your dentist every year, every 6 months, whatever your dental plan can afford you. And whenever the hygienist comes out to the waiting room to greet you to come on in, oh, hi, Mr. Waleed. Oh, my 10 o'clock a.m. non-flosser is here.
Right.
Or like, oh, my, hang on a second, Nancy, I'm waiting for my 11 o'clock never brushes to get here. Or, if your doctor always viewed you through the lens of who knows what, obesity or excess sugar or whatever it is, but in the same breath, get frustrated at you for not addressing that change.
Right.
The change that you've been labeling me the last however many times with.
Yeah.
And again, I would challenge practitioners to stop looking beyond, they read that criminal complaint or that narrative of, on such a date, such a car was stolen, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's my 10:30 appointments here.
Right. Instead of Mr. Jones is here.
And where does Mr. Jones want to be in 5 years when he's crime free?
Absolutely.
What are your hopes and dreams, Mr. Jones? And why don't I just start referring to you as future good father, future sober neighbor, future small business owner, whatever.
Because we all want the same things, and that's security and safety.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, food, housing, clothing, all that security and safety.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And that really gets into another sort of the kissing cousin, if you will, of desistance theory, known as the good lives model. But it's what you just said, Craig. We all have these certain things in life that we want: success in in work, success in play, healthy relationships. But some folks just struggle because they don't have the social skills to attain those things in a pro-social manner. So their quest to attain those things comes out sideways and results in criminality. But it's really all about, I just wanted these good things in life, the satisfaction and these other sort of assets in life. Yeah.
That makes sense too. And, sometimes I think also what may play a part in that is perhaps just coming from, I guess what you pretty much alluded to is coming from a background of depravity, so that could be, physical depravity of, housing, food, clothes, but also emotional and psychological depravity where the people who are responsible for raising you don't have the faculties or the tools to help you become a healthy individual.
Yeah, exactly. I think, and this is also an answer to your earlier question about just sort of what can the average person do. I like to learn from other areas, other jurisdictions. I've been blessed to be involved in some overseas training as of late. But one thing I picked up from my European colleagues, when they train over there, they put much more emphasis on perspective taking from the practitioner, to the client to understand their plight, if you will, rather than just, you're a number with a risk score. And these are the areas that your risk assessment says you're risky in. It's just, Craig, what was it like growing up in your house? Craig, tell me about your experiences in school. And that simple act of perspective taking. I know when we train on, I train in what we refer to as motivational interviewing. And a big piece of that is, and of a lot of the other things we do is really anchored in empathy. But I've noticed at times, at least, some folks who get into corrections and get into criminal justice system, that empathy sort of comes off as a little bit too touchy feely. So I've reframed that, learning from my European friends of like, okay, let's just try perspective taking. And then it's like, oh, okay, now I can relate to that person a lot more. That's an easier sell if I sell it like that. Yeah.
And it's the same thing. Empathy, perspective taking. Yeah. Words matter. Titles matter. Labels matter. And at the end of the day, I think it's really important to do this work until we don't have a job. But I think it's never going to be, because there's always going to be haves and have-nots, So the have-nots are going to always want something, or they're not going to be treated right. But Desistance, that's the closing theme, the opening theme. And I really appreciate you just shedding some of your professional light on what Desistance is. If folks wanted to follow up with you or listen to your podcast or anything, how can they find you?
Thank you. The name of the podcast is The Criminologist. It's available on all of your major podcast platforms. You could visit my website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com. And if you get into the website, you'll see a tab entitled podcast. So all of my back episodes, including my one with Dr. Craig Waleed, can be found off the Paragon Group, LLC website, or you can reach out to us at the Paragon Group at the Criminologist Podcast at gmail.com. If you want to email us for questions or a possible guest appearance, we're always looking for other enlightened individuals to share their experiences. And as I said earlier, tear down these biases and prejudices that get in the way of folks like you and I doing good work, Craig.
Right on, Joe. And with that, I'm going to call it a wrap. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, my friend. Until next time.
Yes, peace.
What a great experience that was, being interviewed by Dr. Craig Waleed for his podcast, Prison to Promise. If you are intrigued and wish to hear more from Craig and his various guests, I have left a link for his Prison to Promise podcast in the episode description of this program. Please check out all of his episodes. And of course, when my episode drops, I will alert you all to that as well. Craig has also authored a book entitled Prison to Promise, a chronicle of healing and transformation. I'm going to leave a link for information on how to secure a copy of your book in the episode description of this podcast as well. To recap those theories of desistance which we touched on during this episode, they were maturation, social bonds, narrative identity, but also places, spaces, and routines, which we were having such an enriching conversation, we didn't get a chance to circle back to that final theory. What I may do is endeavor to have Fergus McNeil back on the program to tease out all of these theories even more so. So thank you, Dr. Waleed, for reminding me to get Fergus back on the Criminologist podcast. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, program design, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email of thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. We are also on Twitter. You may follow the Criminologist Media Group at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, or Craig Waleed on LinkedIn and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this program. Merchandise is now available. You can seek that out through the Paragon Group, LLC.com. Find out how to secure your very own Criminologist coffee mug, refrigerator magnet, or pen. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the show, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us. Vast amounts of LinkedIn connections. They have a lot of social capital.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean they have a lot of friends or a lot of people who haven't been locked up. It's like, no, you have a lot of people that can afford you opportunities for growth.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.